we have another good one for you guys. This is more back to some practical advice and practical guidance on another topic that security leaders are grappling with. Mike Wilkes is our next speaker, and he's going to dive into the topic of third-party risk and resilience. Now, the majority of high-profile security incidents over the past 2 years have highlighted the need for resilience, and the risk introduced by our third parties and supply chains is more on display than ever before. And Jimmy talked about it as well earlier. This presentation is coming right on time. I met Mike through a CISO Slack channel, and I've been a part of for a little while now. He's always had really thought-provoking insights. I know you guys are all going to benefit from this one. Mike, it's all yours, man.
Thanks, Jared. And I just wanted to comment on the former discussion, the previous discussion. It's definitely needed to have more diversity in this space. And that's one of the reasons why I teach at NYU, because I feel at this stage in my career, I should be bringing in more and more voices and perspectives. So even though I'm from the white male, oppressor monkey, community, I do want to, try to influence what's happening overall and help make InfoSec a better practice, a better space for everyone. All right, so let me throw over my slides and get started. So here we are. All right, so building and sustaining TPRM programs, so third-party risk management. SecurityScorecard, I'm the CISO at SecurityScorecard. My name is Mike Wilkes, and I've been, let me first mention the headshot's a little bit out of date, right? But I'm also not this guy either. This is a face, Oldify slide from the Face app, which had a little bit of controversy around it, as I recall, because it's, I think, based out of Russia, but people can find our headshots on LinkedIn anyway, so I figure it wasn't too much information disclosure. So anyway, I'm somewhere in between that headshot and this imaginary future me. So who am I? A little bit about myself. So a couple of things. I wrote a book for Cisco Press back in 2002 when I was working in the .com rise and fall, the roaring 20s of my generation. And that's for a certification that doesn't exist anymore. But that was a great, feather in my cap to get an ISBN, 584 pages, if I remember correctly. Anyway, I was part of the team that worked back in those days at a company called Organic that launched the first website for Starbucks back in 1998. And, that was pretty cool. We called it Web Ops back then, not DevOps. That same team that I led at Organic launched PlayStation.com for the PS2, Macy's.com, a little known entity now these days called Blockbuster. If only they could have seen the future and started streaming instead of Be Kind, Rewind. And of course, many other brands. Then I went and lived and worked in Europe for 11 years and built infrastructure for KLM and Rabobank and ING and energy management systems for Nuon, Vattenfall. That's when Stuxnet came out, and I was actually building systems that had PLCs in them, programmable logic controllers. So I know firsthand that it's all held together with duct tape and baling wire. Then moved back to the US in 2013 and ran the Chicago Mercantile Exchange enterprise server platform with about $2 quadrillion in contracts traded. And that was a great experience. I really enjoyed working at the CME. After that, I moved on and I worked at a hedge fund, AQR Capital, for a while. But the one that most people are interested in hearing stories about was when I was head of security at Marvel, where I like to joke it was my job to keep Iron Man safe. And that was as cool as you could imagine. Iron Man statues in the office and everyone watching movies and reading comics, and that was their job. And it was my job to keep them safe. So I've been doing infrastructure for a long time and worked in lots of different industries. And most recently, before SecurityScorecard, I was the CISO at ASCAP, the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers. And that is a great organization if you haven't heard of it. I'm an ASCAP member. I'm a musician. I play drums. I play jazz. And I really loved being able to build the security program there before coming to SecurityScorecard. But let's move forward with the agenda. So first, second, and third-party risk. I wanted to define these. I have a background in philosophy, actually. And so I like to talk a lot about the meanings of words and make sure we're on the same page as far as what we are doing and the problems we're trying to solve. Then I want to talk about discovery of risk and continuous monitoring, of course, event-based assessments, and then summarize what I was going over. So first, breaking down this concept of risk. So first-party risk is self-attestation. You have complete internal awareness, or at least you should, right, for asset management and the risks on your fleet of servers and services. You exhibit trust through control. At least I presume you have control over your infrastructure. And then enterprise risk management is sort of the category, the framework that's used for first-party risk. Second-party risk isn't talked about a lot, but that's your customers, right? And so this is customer attestation. They have firsthand partial awareness of how your platform performs, whether they're trying to do a money transfer, wire transfer, in a bank or through Western Union to a family member. If that service fails, they've experienced that failure. And so they have a partial awareness. Trust here is exhibited through familiarity and brand loyalty. And essentially the domain of risk is contractual risk management, right? You have terms and conditions that are signed or at least clicked through on these different widgets and processes and services. Third-party risk has had a real heyday the last year and a half, or pretty much over all of COVID, due to SolarWinds and Kaseya and the Microsoft proxy logon attack and Excelian vulnerabilities. And so you have an external attestation approach here. Think of a pen test, right? You're not necessarily asking your internal team to pen test your app. You want to go to a third party because of their impartiality. You want them to come in with a fresh perspective and test things that maybe your internal team wouldn't have thought of testing. And so that's useful to understand that that's sort of the domain of attestation. You have an incomplete awareness of what's running on these stacks, but hopefully tools like security scanning, security ratings like we offer, we're scanning all of the internet every day. And that's how we're able to identify some of this risk that you may not be aware of because of your assets. And I'll get to that in a minute. Trust is exhibited through impartiality, at least in third party. You like to think that third party auditors are impartial. And then, of course, this is the domain and the sweet spot for vendor risk management or third-party risk management. And then, of course, your vendors have suppliers and partners and vendors as well. And that's what we call fourth-party risk, or to the logical extension here, nth party risk. Here you have things like peer attestation. You have things like Yelp that are used. You have Glassdoor, right? You have different ways of getting a sense of that application stack, but you really have a minimal awareness of what's running there. And trust is essentially exhibited through proxy. You trust the fourth party because you've signed up the third party to be one of your service providers. And then, of course, ecosystem risk management, I think, is a kind of a different term. It's not used a lot. But I like to think of it as more than just a supply chain of 3 links. It's not just your upstream provider, you and your downstream customers and subscribers. So let me dive into those a little bit real quick, because I wanted to mention a couple of things about each of those 4 dimensions. So in terms of attestation, if Colonial Pipeline had performed a self-assessment in 2020, what would have changed with that breach? I would say nothing, actually, right? We need tools that can validate assertions of compliance. Colonial Pipeline's team would have said, yeah, we have all the controls in place that we feel we need to have in place. That's why we believe that we run a trusted, and observable and secure platform. So I think that having tools that can sort of prove or disprove various assertions that come from self-attestation or from these questionnaires that get sent around all the time, where people just sort of answer them with creative fiction sometimes, or they hand it down to an intern to fill out because we just get so many of them. So I'd like us to try to stop this dance of sending out questionnaires once a year. Then in terms of the awareness dimension, who really can afford to scan and monitor all of our vendor APIs, their websites, the certificate expirations on them, and all of those services? So one of the things that security ratings companies like us and our competitors in this space do is we do that for you. So we're scanning all of IPv4 every day. And some segments like cloud service network provider IPs on Amazon and on Google and on Microsoft, we scan those 12 times a day. Why? Because those are really fast moving currents, right? The IP address and the attribution of who's running what behind in a given IP could change several times a day, potentially. In terms of trust, I wanted to bring up zero trust architecture. So if ZTA refers to this catchphrase of never trust, always verify, then for what values of always are practical? Do we simply, insert 3-factor authentication, 4-factor authentication, 5-factor authentication, ad infinitum? And here I like to refer to a Saturday Night Live skit that was talking about disposable razor blades many years ago. And they were joking, because I think 2-blade razors were coming out. And so Saturday Night Live had this skit about a 5-blade disposable razor. It was complete satire, right? But of course we have that product now. You can buy 5-blade disposables. And that shouldn't be our path forward for trust. We shouldn't keep on just layering on more and more factors because we really need to get at the heart of what's going on. And I think something called adaptive authentication or multi-factor just-in-time authentication can look at telemetry from all sorts of other factors and bump up or down the number of factors needed for the transaction based on the risk score that comes back from these different people that have an opinion. Did the person fail an authentication challenge recently? Was there a quarantine event, right, from the endpoint management tool? Did they click on a phishing test that month? And so maybe you want to bump them up to 2-factor just for that transaction alone. And then lastly, the dimension of management. When the Ever Given, that super tanker, 20,000 TEUs of containers, lodged itself sideways in the Suez Canal in March for 6 days, how many markets were affected, right? Supply chain is not just about first-degree neighbors upstream and downstream of goods and services. It has to be about the entire ecosystem. And so how do we tackle this? Well, it's hard, right? The fourth quartile, the last quartile of risk. This is the thing we're going after, right? Most of us can find and build a program and tools and people and process that will help identify the first, second, or even third quartile of risk. Now with the fourth quartile, the last quartile, we're talking about risks that are really, really improbable, but highly impactful, like Facebook deciding to configure their BGP routes incorrectly and just winking out of existence in a couple of minutes. That was a fantastic example of complex systems and systemic risk, and an edge case that you shouldn't have to worry about, right? The entire ASN was just not being broadcast anymore for BGP. Anyway, so that's one of the identifications of these risks, these edge cases for different attacks. And if risk is equal to likelihood type impact, again, we're talking about really big impact, but low probability items. How do we mitigate that? You can spend millions of dollars trying to mitigate this last sort of quartile of risk. And of course, there's a decreasing ROI. So if you're going to stand up, a complete hot infrastructure, and you're going to run it on one cloud service provider here and another cloud service provider there, in case the cloud service provider goes up, and makes a mistake. And even Amazon has shown that they know how to make mistakes, right? There was a complete outage of US East a while back, and people really learned the meaning of the word concentration risk that day. I think it was like November of 2020. And it was a Kinesis problem. They ran out of max threads, on their entire fleet of Kinesis servers for Linux max threads. That's a simple mistake, right? But it hit at scale. It only occurs at scale. Some problems only occur at scale. And so that's why I think it's useful to find as much automation and scaling as we can out of our tools to identify risk. Third-party risk for e-commerce. Of course, you're looking at malware infections, you're looking at credential theft, you're looking at issues of fraud that can take place through the use of compromised credit cards or even tokens, that are authorized to perform transactions. You have a loss of inventory, of course. Business disruptions, a denial of service attack or a distributed denial of service attack can hit any of your third parties and impact you. So do you know if they have a WAF in place? Do you know if they have a DDoS subscription? You can learn these things by looking up at the DNS records and figuring out who's actually the CNAME behind a particular host name. I've set up these things for Marvel, for example, and put it behind a DDoS subscription. And this is publicly information. I'm not sharing anything that you can't learn about by looking at the internet, or at least looking at DNS records. And then, of course, identifying data theft when it happens, and be able to watch the exfiltration of the Colonial Pipeline data to a DigitalOcean server here in New York. We actually have a threat intelligence team that saw that happen like a day or two before the ransomware hit, because they steal, obviously, and then use it for extortion purposes. Colonial Pipeline had backups. They didn't have to buy the decryption key because they didn't have backups. They had to buy it because they didn't want the data that was stolen to be released on the internet. And then, of course, what else? Financial transactions, billing and payment information, invoice fraud, all sorts of things are happening, in the e-commerce world. And so how can you keep a handle on that? Well, you need to discover what your risk is. And here I'd like to talk about what we call declarative infrastructure versus de facto infrastructure. And so vulnerability management tools can typically scan your inside assets and a few of your internet facing assets, but you're not going to be able to scan every single IP address and service, of your partners and service providers. That's, again, one of the useful reasons, one of the useful features of having a security ratings company that's doing that for you. We scan the whole internet so you don't have to. Then, of course, you can mitigate these controls, right? We live in a left of boom space. Boom is typically referred to in military sectors. It's like the event, right? The bad event, the breach or other type of incident. We're a proactive tool. We help you figure out what your risk profile is prior to bad things happening. So if you have a D, for example, or lower in our scores, you're 7.7 times more likely to be breached than someone with an A. That doesn't mean you're not going to get breached, or attacked if you have an A. FireEye was attacked by, APT29, Cozy Bear, and they got breached through SolarWinds. So it doesn't mean you can't. And this is the mantra I think that a lot of people have heard by now. It's not a matter of if you'll be, breached or there'll be an incident. It's just a matter of when. And so how quickly can you recover? What's your resilience? What's your ability to detect and be aware of the breach and then begin working the incident? Pen tests, of course, always start with a request of IP addresses. What should we be testing? And oftentimes the declarative assets don't know about some type of rogue IT or shadow ops, right? That black ops had been set up in the background without everyone knowing it. Maybe we should use a different word or term for that because we don't want to have like whitelist, blacklist as these pejorative terms that have cultural baggage. So I would maybe change that slide and just talk about forgotten assets, right? That somebody stood up on Linode with a credit card, in marketing for building a WordPress site temporarily, got it into your DNS, and now it's an attack surface. But the team didn't know about it, right? So our scanning can help you discover that. Here's an example of an open system. This is a SCADA system, so we talk a lot about the risk of operation technology and industrial control systems. Having built these systems myself, I know that a lot of them are fragile. If you even try to scan them, they'll fall over. So there's different approaches that have to be taken to protecting OT and not just putting an IP address on everything that controls a water treatment power plant in Florida or the Texas grid mostly going offline because of bad weather in February. And so there's systemic risks that come from these complex systems. Indeed, someone didn't realize probably that they provisioned this with open access to the internet, and anyone can go and change these systems and just log into them with a default credential. So here's the point where I like to bring up one of my favorite quotes. This is a philosopher and historian, Heraclitus, a Greek philosopher. And he essentially said something that roughly translates to, you can never step into the same river twice. And for me, I love this particular quote because this is not AI or machine learning hype curve from Gartner and Forrester and things like that. This is what you might call OG InfoSec. And I think the analogy, the river analogy, works really well for InfoSec. Some folks, they just want to sit in an inner tube, with a 6-pack of beer and float lazily along the winding oxbow of the river. And other people's digital journey, they're strapping on a helmet and they're heading straight for those class 5 rapids in order to get to the next stretch, right? Move your stuff to the cloud, figure out how to monitor it, figure out how to do logging for ephemeral, elastic, auto-scaling infrastructure. And so I love this analogy because it's just hard to argue with the fact that, the river is changing every day, right? And I'm not the same security officer I was a year ago, right? The entire threat landscape has changed. Everyone's working from home. And so the river changes, but we change as well. And I think this quote helps capture that. So in terms of continuous monitoring, this is the only thing I wanted to throw out that's kind of pitchy. Security ratings, our platform at least, has 11 million companies that we're tracking. And we update that by scanning the internet every day. And we see, like I mentioned, millions of IP addresses with billions of vulnerabilities. So we see 30 to 40 billion security findings every week by our scanning engine. And we operate a top 5 sinkhole. So we see about 700 million malware events coming into our sinkholes every day as well. And we can attribute them to which IP addresses they're coming from. So we know if a company is compromised because it's reaching out to our sinkholes. And so that's an important aspect, I think, of just being aware of the security risks and the scope and magnitude of how many insecure platforms are currently operating and how many have already been breached that maybe haven't even been realized if the bad guys are playing low and slow, as it's called, instead of doing like a smash and grab with a ransomware play. The other thing I'd like to talk about briefly is just when you do have this idea of event-based assessments, instead of sending out a questionnaire once a year, the first question is, have you been breached in the last 12 months? Well, that's the last moment that you want to learn, yes, we were breached 11 months ago, right? Shields up, right? You really don't want to be doing it this way. You want to have some type of monitoring in place. And so you can write rules that will trigger sending an assessment based on a score drop, a breach event, or even a single CVE appearing on you or one of your third parties' scorecards. And so in this case, the process of reassessing whether you should stay with that vendor, right? Think about the legal reviews. Let's say you're on a 3-year contract, with a company, and every year you kind of send out this questionnaire and ask them, what has changed? Has the company been acquired, right? Slack was bought by Salesforce. Do you now distrust Slack? Do you start using Slack for more, sensitive data? Have you integrated, Jenkins builds and bots, that are using it to approve, promotion and deployments, maybe the scope of the data classification of using that vendor has changed. And so that's why you need to do these assessments, especially as things keep changing, right? In Heraclitus's river of risk. Of course, the vendor disposition going into the assessment has essentially 4 categories in my mind, right? You have your cannot fail vendors. This is due to nepotism, right? Golf course handshakes between CEOs, right? This happens. There's some chances that you're never going to be able to offboard certain vendors. So they can't fail their reassessment. Then, of course, there's the already doomed, already failed. They breached your contract, or someone's completely done with using them for whatever reason. Then there's, of course, vendors that have an increased risk profile since you last looked at it, and vendors that have a decreased risk profile. Maybe you're only using it, for creating, a marketing campaign for swag, and you're only sending them their logo to do a beer cozy, right, or to do a t-shirt. So maybe that relationship is not as tight, and the data classification is decreased over time. And then, of course, event types, breach, score drop, any particular issue you're finding. The idea of being able to have this happen automatically and at scale. We have some customers with 20,000 vendors in their portfolio, and they're able to do that without having like a 300-person vendor risk management team. Why? Because we can tie the assessments and the sending of assessments to particular portfolios. So let's say you have a tier 1 set of vendors, and they go down, you go down, right? So you're going to send them like maybe a SIG full as soon as something bad happens, right? Other ones, maybe you just send a SIG light, a few hundred questions just saying, hey, we just noticed that your security posture is headed downwards and it might head towards a breach. Can you help us understand, and what are your plans to mitigate these issues that have been discovered? Along with event-based assessments, tying in scanning of the internet with automated security framework settings. We have about 30 frameworks that we have on the platform that you can send to people, whether it's NIST 800/53, which is pretty heavyweight, or a CAIQ or a PCI or things like that. But anyway, this is a really powerful combination, right, of combining scanning and security assessments and security ratings with continuous monitoring. And you get this benefit of immediate reassessments with a vendor with zero touch from the InfoSec team. It scales to thousands of continuously monitored companies. Some of our customers are looking to try to reach 40,000 and more vendors on their scorecards and portfolio. Think of like an Intel class company or Nike or Apple, right? Their supply chain risk is enormous. Scaling to these, of course, continuously monitored companies instead of just choosing a few. Most people might do, I don't know, at best, maybe 50 tier 1 vendors every year, and they just can't get around to doing the tier 2s or the tier 3s. This helps you do that. Of course, score drop events, breach events, trigger sending the assessment. You can tailor the assessment. We created a 3-question questionnaire for SolarWinds, and we just sent it out to all of our core vendors. And so they just said, yes, we have it, or no, we don't. And if they do, have they patched? So you can customize and tailor these assessments as well, just to be very focused and singular. Then, of course, you can maintain a really small VRM team with this kind of automation and scaling. So what happens when you have a shields up event? Which rule was triggered? Do you want to disable the vendor access in their integrations? You can use the security orchestration and automated response products, right? A SOAR solution for this. So this is not tied entirely to just using our platform, but our platform helps make this easier if you don't have a SOAR tied to your SIEM, right? Which is gathering all these events and looking at all this telemetry. Of course, which assessment do you send? And then what are the conditions for standing down? When do you go back to normal business as usual? And so the other thing I wanted to touch on here is some of the most popular frameworks that we see our customers using with our Atlas product. And so we see a lot of folks using SIG, which has the 3 flavors, right? SigCore, SigLite, SigFull. I think they've just recently been revised as well to include less questions than they used to. And then, of course, NIST CSF or NIST 800/53. ISO is running for a lot of the international customers, global footprint. So ISO 27001 is very popular. And then CMMC, the cyber maturity matrix. And of course, this is probably what's going to shock some people. The turnaround time to having a web-based portal for assessments and answers and questions becomes 7 days on average to turn around. A lot of people I know previously to working even at SecurityScorecard would end up spending 3 to 6 months trying to get one of these questionnaires filled out from a vendor. And of course, it takes about 2 days for the sender to close it out and about 3 or 4 iterations. So maybe there's a little bit of follow-up on an answer that didn't have any evidence attached. But that's really removing the friction of onboarding new vendors, right? And getting the security assessments done and doing it in an exhaustive kind of fashion. It's not a huge burden because whenever these vendors fill out a questionnaire, we use AI and machine learning to help you auto answer or auto respond to similar questions from similar frameworks. So if I go in and do a CAIQ, I've already answered, half the questions needed, for a SigLite. And so it actually pre-populates those, matched answers for you, so that you're actually spending less time, in Excel hell, answering all these spreadsheet questions and emailing them around. And then, of course, most customers are actually sending custom questionnaires rather than the standard frameworks, of which I said we have about 30. So what does that actually look like? Here's a SigCore example. The SigCore, I believe, is something around 1,000 questions across 18 individual risk controls. And the SigLite, about 330 questions, and the SigFull was maybe 1,600, although I think they've backed down in the latest versions for 2022 that are coming out. And you can find these on sharedassessments.org. SecurityScorecard is a partner with Shared Assessments, and we're actually working on releasing, I think this month, a taxonomy white paper where we cooperated with BitSight, Risk Recon, Panarrays, UpGuard. I think they're called Black Kite now. Anyway, we're raising up the bar for the entire security ratings industry, and cooperating and making sure everyone's using the same words and names for various risks and signals and findings, just to help make it less confusing for everyone, no matter what product you choose. I think there's enough room for everyone to do a good job in this space at the moment. And then what does it look like if you're doing a SigCore? So you can actually fill it out here. You can see, this is a SigCore being filled out for a fictitious entity called resourcedscarcity.com. And it's really straightforward, right? You have this ability to do attachments, you can do chats, and you can tell which questions are filled out. There's other solutions and tools out there that do this. But what's nice about our platform is it actually shows the scanning results next to their answers, which can either prove or disprove their assertion. Let's say that they patch their servers every 30 days, whenever a critical vulnerability comes out. Well, then why is our scanning showing that there's a CVE from 2020? That means there's a violation of that control. And so it's useful, like I said, to be able to point that out. And then it's just as simple as this. You just write a rule and you say new breach reported, go ahead and send a particular questionnaire, or a CVE is detected. So if there's a very particular one that you want, I created a portfolio of all of the Department of Energy's national labs. So there's 17 national laboratories. And I just thought, it'd be interesting to know if someone's breaking into, the nuclear arsenal that's controlled at, Oak Ridge or of the other national labs. And so it's pretty straightforward, create a portfolio, write a rule against it, you suddenly have event-based assessments. So in summary, first and second, third-party risk, systemic risk essentially is an emergent property of complex systems. And if we all pay attention to the health and resilience of the ecosystem and not just our first link and second link, first degree and second degree partners, then the entire supply chain will be addressed more thoroughly, more holistically. And of course, discovery of risk, there's only one network. It's called the internet, right? There is no inside or outside anymore, right? Security is not an execution problem. It's a design problem. And that's what zero trust architecture, hopefully implemented, will help us achieve. Continuous monitoring, no news is good news, right? When security professionals do our jobs well, then the technology is not discussed. Just like the fish don't talk about the water. So I would love to see these discussions sort of recede into the background as security and the platforms that we're running in the cloud become much more like a commodity and not like a pet that needs lots of care and feeding. And then of course, event-based assessments. Automate what you can and delegate the rest. There's no dignity in suffering the toils of repetitive tasks and error-prone habits. Seek effortless scale and do what you can to focus on the interesting work. Lastly, a quick plug for the World Economic Forum. SecurityScorecard was named a technology pioneer in 2020. And so I've been working on the working groups for cybersecurity and cyber risk and principles. So these are the 6 principles that will eventually cascade their way down to the NACD and eventually hit your company. So get ready to answer these questions. Do you align with these principles? And so there's a link in the slides, which you can request in a minute, to this report. And then the one that came out in August, which is oil and gas, particular working groups that I'm on. But this one is applicable to all industries. And so this is a whole bunch of case studies that talk about specific implementations of security awareness, security scanning, continuous monitoring, and cyber resilience. So this takes me to my final slide. Go ahead and, if you'd like a copy of this deck, point your phone at this QR code. It's not malware. It's just a mail to link. And I will be happy to send you a copy of the deck and follow up with you if you have any questions or if you'd like to check out our platform and understand how to operate, and build a third-party risk management program. So that's it. Any questions from the questions? Let's take a look. What do we have?
Hey, Mike, thank you for this well-structured conversation and presentation on all the different ways we can manage our third parties. You have a few questions that have come in. One of the first ones is around how do you integrate threat intelligence with automated risk assessments?
Oh, well, the attack surface is vulnerabilities, but you don't know which ones are being actively pursued. And so we are building out a threat intelligence offering and a team that says, guess what, of the 20 or 30 vulnerabilities on your platform, we actually see active exploitation attempts against these particular ones. So we're using things like NetFlow data and threat hunting. We built out an incredible team. We actually poached a bunch of really good talent from McAfee lately. And so we're going to be offering a complimentary service here that says, this is your attack surface, and these are the things you should focus on due to active signals.
Okay. And another question, and I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit, but a lot of companies already have some form of risk management tooling in place. How do you get your competitors to play in the same sandbox with you and to share information and allow for those integrations?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a good challenge to speak to. In my mind, most of our customers should be consuming our product through the API, and they should be putting our scores next to some other GRC tool or in ServiceNow, right, for doing procurement and contract management. If you're going to take a short list of 10 vendors down to 2 or 3, just run the scorecards on them and just don't even bother asking for an RFP from somebody with an F. And so we want to integrate with, because we know we're just one leg of a 4 or 5 person relay race, right? We're not the only tool that's out there that's helping identify risk, and we're not sufficient, but I do believe we're necessary. You need to have that complete external visibility into what's happening. And so how do we compete with our sort of adjacent service providers? I would just say integrate, right, and put our scores in other management dashboards. Don't worry about trying to log into our platform and look at 20,000 scorecards. Integrate it with your other business intelligence systems, right?
Thank you. Well, Mike made it easy for you guys. You guys have a QR code if you are interested in having the PDF version of what he just presented.